In a previous lesson, you learned how to set up ratios or speeds on the front side of the flight computer. Now let's get some experience and see how you can use this in your flying. First, let's say you've traveled 180 miles and it took you 2 hours. You'd like to know how fast you were traveling. Well, by setting up one of those ratios you learned about, you can figure it out. In this case, use the 18 on the outer scale to represent the 180 miles. And you need to put 2 hours on the inner scale. So move around to 2 hours, and you can see that 2 hours is also 120 minutes, or 12 on the minute scale. And this is lined up under the 18 on the outer scale, which represents 180 miles. What we're doing is we're setting up a ratio. But just off the top of your head, if you traveled 180 miles and it took you 2 hours, how fast were you traveling? Well, since you traveled 180 miles in 2 hours and you want to know how fast you were going per hour, you need to take half of 180. So you're doing 90 knots. But let's confirm that with the flight computer. Move the whole flight computer around and look for 60 minutes on the inner scale. That's what the arrow or pointer is. When you find the 60 minutes on the inner scale, the outer scale will tell you how many miles you're going to cover in that 60 minutes. And sure enough, you're going to cover 90 miles in that 60 minutes, or you'll be traveling 90 knots. Now let's take a look at a different problem. Let's say you're going to be traveling at 100 knots, and you've got to travel 250 miles. The question is, how long will it take you to cover that distance? Whenever you start a problem on the front of the computer and you know how fast you are going, the first thing you put on the computer is how fast. So how fast are we going? We're doing 100 knots or 100 nautical miles in 60 minutes. Now we don't have a 100 on the flight computer, so we're going to use the 10 to represent it instead. So here's the 10 on the outer scale. Now rotate the inner dial until 60 minutes is underneath the 10. Representing 100 miles. We're setting up the ratio that says how fast we're traveling. The 10 on the outer scale, representing the 100 miles that we're traveling, is next to the 60 minutes on the inner scale. We've got our ratio set on the flight computer. Now, we want to know if we fly for 250 miles, how long will it take us to do that? What you need to do next is look around the outer scale of the flight computer. Don't move the inner dial, but move the whole flight computer and look for 25. You do not have a 250 on the flight computer. You're going to have to use 25 to represent 250 miles. You find the 25 on the outer scale, and the next scale in will tell you how many minutes it will take you to fly 250 miles. It will take 150 minutes to fly 250 miles. If you look on the far inner scale of the flight computer, you'll see that 150 minutes is 2 hours and 30 minutes. Now, common sense will tell you that it has to be 150 minutes and not 15 minutes because you're only doing 100 knots. So it's going to take 150 minutes or 2 hours and 30 minutes to cover the distance of 250 miles. Now one last problem. At 140 knots, you fly for 2 hours. How far will you have gone in those 2 hours? Just in your head, if you're flying at 140 knots and you fly for 2 hours, how many miles will you have covered? Twice 140 or 280 miles. Let's take a look at it on the flight computer. What's the first thing we want to put in the computer? How fast? How fast are we going? We're going 140 knots or 140 nautical miles in 60 minutes. Since we don't have 140, you'll use the 14 to represent 140. And here's the 14 on the outer scale. You're doing 140 knots or 140 nautical miles in 60 minutes. So rotate the inner scale until 60 minutes is underneath the 14. Set up the ratio of 140 miles in 60 minutes. Now you're going to fly for 2 hours. Look around the inner scale of the flight computer. 2 hours is 120 minutes. When you find the 12 on the inner scale for 120 minutes, the far inner scale confirms that it is 2 hours of flying. And the outer scale says that you will have covered 280 miles. That's 250, 260, 270, 280 miles. What you're doing is setting up a ratio on the flight computer. And once you have that ratio set up, there are all kinds of problems that you can figure out. Let's recap with 4 rules you should remember when you're using the flight computer. First, how fast? How fast always goes first on the circular slide rule side of the computer, because that's the most important thing that you have to put on there. Next, miles are always on the outer scale of the flight computer, and time is on the inner scale. And lastly, does it make any sense when I get done working it out? As you get experience with the circular slide rule side of the computer, you'll see how handy it is in the cockpit and why you'll never want to fly without it.